King Charles III quietly receives a confidential legal dossier that shatters his ultimate authority. For years, the king operated under the absolute assumption that he controlled the entire flow of royal assets, titles, and properties. But on March 25, 2026, a meticulously documented file delivered by his own brother proves he does not. What King Charles discovered inside those pages did not just cost him a £30 million estate, it exposed a fundamental misunderstanding of his own power. Before we uncover what truly happened behind palace walls, take a moment to subscribe. Stories of this magnitude rarely end where they begin, and there are always hidden details the headlines never tell you. But that single, humiliating legal defeat only makes sense once we go back several years to a deeply private promise made by a dying queen. So, Prince Edward just pulled off something that honestly nobody saw coming. And the way he executed it is far more fascinating than what he actually won. For decades, the global public viewed the Duke of Edinburgh as the quietest member of the British royal family. He was the brother who stayed entirely out of the tabloid headlines, avoided the catastrophic scandals, and simply kept his head down while the rest of the family engaged in endless public warfare. But on March 25, 2026, the quietest man in the palace delivered the loudest and most humiliating blow to the reign of King Charles III. To understand the sheer shockwave this caused, you have to understand the specific mindset operating inside Buckingham Palace at that exact moment. For years, Charles had been governing under an assumption that seemed entirely unquestionable to him. He believed that, as the sovereign, he possessed the absolute, final say over the reorganization of the family's wealth and assets. He was the king. He firmly believed his sweeping modernization strategy gave him the unassailable right to review every property, rethink every royal title, and, if he deemed it necessary for the survival of the crown, take things back. On that quiet Tuesday afternoon, a thick legal dossier landed on the king's desk, essentially telling the monarch that his absolute power was a complete illusion. Prince Edward did not just win a bitter family argument, he legally paralyzed the institution. And he accomplished this impossible feat by being the one person in the Windsor family who apparently kept every single receipt. The primary battleground for this legal explosion was Bagshot Park, a sprawling, 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion, situated on 51 acres of prime land inside Windsor Great Park. King Charles looked at Bagshot Park and saw a highly lucrative £30 million asset sitting in the hands of a junior royal. His closest advisors saw a prime opportunity to cut costs, restructure the royal portfolio, and demonstrate to a struggling British public that the monarchy was streamlining. They assumed Prince Edward would quietly surrender his home of more than 2 decades, just as other family members had yielded to the new, ruthless regime. But they severely underestimated the man they were dealing with. When the intense pressure from the king's office began building, Edward did not leak his grievances to the press. He did not give emotional television interviews about his mistreatment. Instead, he quietly assembled a legal file so airtight that the highest-paid lawyers in the land could not find a single actionable flaw. He arrived not with emotional complaints, but with cold, hard legal precedent. He arrived with heavily bound lease agreements spanning 150 years, heavily documented financial transfers, proving he used millions of his own private money to restore the estate, and a paper trail that left the king completely trapped. Charles had assumed he was dealing with an obedient younger brother who would simply bow to the hierarchy of the crown. He never anticipated facing a calculated legal strategist who had spent decades preparing for this exact betrayal. The king's legal team furiously reviewed the Bagshot Park file and eventually delivered the crushing news. The king had absolutely no legal right to evict his brother. The property was securely locked down. Charles had lost. But as the king angrily turned the final pages of the dossier, he realized that the danger was not just in the lease agreements or the financial spreadsheets. Edward had hidden something else inside that file. King Charles was about to realize that the true threat to his authority was not coming from his brother. It was coming from a secret document, signed years before he took the throne. To truly comprehend the emotional devastation behind this legal warfare, we must step away from the cold paperwork and look at what Bagshot Park actually represents. This was never merely a dispute over real estate. For Prince Edward, this was a profoundly personal insult that struck at the very core of his lifelong loyalty to the crown. The palace machinery was attempting to strip away the one sanctuary he had spent his entire adult life building, and they were doing it under the guise of institutional modernization. When Bagshot Park was first offered to Edward back in 1998, it was not the magnificent £30 million royal estate we see today. It was an absolute ruin. After the army chaplaincy left the premise in 1996, the sprawling 120-room mansion sat empty, decaying, and entirely neglected. The Crown Estate considered the property such a severe financial burden that there were serious internal discussions about converting it into a corporate conference center or a public hotel. Nobody within the senior royal family wanted anything to do with it. Edward took on the immense burden. But he did not simply demand public funds to fix his new home. Instead, he poured nearly £3 million into the estate's massive restoration, and crucially, a significant portion of that funding came from his own personal wealth money he had earned privately through his television production company before stepping up as a full-time working royal. He personally financed the resurrection of a dying royal asset. Once the dust settled and the heavy renovations were complete, Edward quietly agreed to a new rent of £90,000 a year, a figure strictly verified by the National Audit Office as fair market value. In 2007, he went even further, paying £5 million up front through his private company to secure a 150-year lease. He followed every single rule. He paid his own way, and this is exactly where the emotional injustice truly begins to fester. While Edward was quietly writing massive checks to maintain his home, his older brother, Prince Andrew, was residing just a few miles away at Royal Lodge. For years, Andrew lived in sprawling luxury without ever paying a true market rate, shielded by the very institution that was now turning its crosshairs on Edward. One brother created endless scandals and was continuously protected. The other brother did everything perfectly and was suddenly treated like a financial liability. But the deepest wound was tied to his name. For decades, Edward had patiently waited to inherit the title of Duke of Edinburgh. It was the title that had defined his father, Prince Philip, for over 70 years. When King Charles finally handed Edward the dukedom in 2023, it felt like a lifetime promise had been beautifully fulfilled. Yet, less than 3 years later, the same king was attempting to evict him from the grand estate that gave that title its true historical gravity. Without Bagshot Park, the Dukedom of Edinburgh becomes little more than an empty name, a title, without a territorial seat, a duke without a true domain. Edward realized exactly what was happening behind closed doors. He was not just being audited, he was being deliberately weakened by his own brother. The institution was actively punishing the most loyal soldier in its ranks. Edward knew he was being marginalized. But he also knew something Charles did not. A quiet, unbreakable arrangement made by Queen Elizabeth before she died. To understand why Prince Edward's legal dossier possessed such devastating power, we must step back in time. We must return to the quiet, highly guarded corridors of Windsor Castle during the final, fading months of Queen Elizabeth II's extraordinary reign. Behind closed doors, the late Queen possessed a razor-sharp understanding of her family's true dynamics. She had spent over 7 decades watching the invisible machinery of the monarchy operate. She knew perfectly well how the institution could quietly marginalize and eliminate anyone it no longer found useful. And as she looked toward the future, she recognized exactly what would happen the moment power transferred to her eldest son, King Charles III. Elizabeth knew that Charles intended to aggressively shrink the monarchy. She knew that without her absolute protection, her youngest son, Edward, and his fiercely loyal wife, Sophie, would immediately become prime targets for a ruthless institutional restructuring. Because they sat lower in the line of succession, they lacked the inherent constitutional armor that protected the direct heirs. But it was not just the Queen who foresaw this looming threat, it was Prince Philip. In the early spring of 2021, as the Duke of Edinburgh's health rapidly declined, a profound sense of urgency gripped the sovereign's private apartments. Philip had held his formidable title for nearly 3/4 of a century. He knew that the dukedom was destined to pass to Edward, but Philip was a pragmatist. He realized that giving his son a grand title was utterly meaningless if the new regime could simply strip away the very estate that gave that title its prestige and operational base. Philip refused to leave his youngest son defenseless against the incoming administration. What happened next remained a closely guarded secret for years. The Queen summoned her most trusted private legal advisors. In a quiet room, away from the prying eyes of the future king's staff, Elizabeth drafted a highly confidential letter of intent. This was not a casual memorandum. It was a legally binding royal directive explicitly designed to tie the Dukedom of Edinburgh directly to the Bagshot Park estate for the entirety of Edward's lifetime. The document boldly stated that the estate and the title were inextricably linked by the explicit will of the sovereign, and to ensure this directive carried the maximum historical and emotional weight, Prince Philip, in his final days, formally witnessed the document. This was the ultimate royal insurance policy. It was a dying patriarch and a brilliantly strategic monarch locking down the future for the son who had never caused them a single day of public embarrassment. They constructed an invisible fortress around Bagshot Park, burying the paperwork deep within the royal archives, knowing that one day, Edward would need it to survive his own brother's ambition. When Queen Elizabeth passed away in September 2022, she left behind a legacy of absolute authority. The new king assumed he had inherited a blank slate, fully unaware that his mother had booby-trapped his modernization plans from beyond the grave. When Charles tried to seize the house, he did not realize he was openly defying the documented, dying wishes of his own parents. That signature should have been enough to protect them. But the new regime inside Buckingham Palace was not willing to accept defeat. Denied the sprawling estate, the king's office aggressively pivoted, seeking a vulnerability the late queen could not have anticipated. They had found a different target, one far more personal than a house. When the brutal reality of the Bagshot Park lease failure finally settled within the corridors of Buckingham Palace, the institutional machinery did not stop. Instead, it quietly shifted its focus. Having lost the battle over a grand estate, the new regime sought a different avenue to establish dominance over Prince Edward and his household. They abandoned brick and mortar, turning their attention towards something infinitely more personal, delicate, and emotionally devastating: gold and diamonds. Earlier that same year, long before the legal dossier paralyzed the king, a mid-ranking palace official arrived at the Edinburgh household with a clipboard and a very quiet instruction. The visit originated directly from the office of Queen Camilla. It was politely framed in the official paperwork as a routine jewelry audit, heavily described as a standard national heritage check designed to catalog historical royal assets. But stripped of its polite bureaucratic language, the actual intent of the visit was shockingly hostile. The institution was launching a direct investigation into the personal jewelry box of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. And at the absolute center of this unprecedented audit was one single, highly significant item: the Enthymion's tiara. To understand the intense psychological cruelty of targeting this specific piece, one must understand its unique history. The Enthymion's tiara was not a random item casually pulled from a dusty royal vault. It was custom commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II, specifically for Sophie's wedding day in 1999. The late monarch had instructed the crown jewelers to construct the piece using 4 stunning antique diamond elements, shaped in a delicate honeysuckle design completely sourced from the private collection of Queen Victoria. For more than 25 years, this magnificent piece was the only tiara Sophie ever wore. That specific detail matters immensely in the unspoken hierarchy of the British royal family. Unlike other senior royal women who were frequently granted open access to the grand state tiaras, Sophie was historically kept one step lower in the visual pecking order. She was never placed at the glittering center. The Enthymion's tiara became her singular royal armor, her one defining crown. To remove it would be to strip away her entire visual identity as a senior royal. The legal argument presented by Queen Camilla's office was sharp and calculated. They argued that because the tiara was constructed using Queen Victoria's antique stones, those specific historical elements legally classified the piece as crown property. Therefore, the tiara should be immediately surrendered to the central royal vault, where it could be properly managed and issued out only for official state use. The unspoken message behind this legal maneuvering was utterly devastating. If the tiara was reclassified, Sophie would lose ownership of the crown she wore on her wedding day. Going forward, every time a state banquet or a diplomatic reception arose, the Duchess of Edinburgh would be forced to submit a formal, humiliating request to Queen Camilla just to wear her own wedding gift. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a brilliant bureaucratic power play designed to force a highly popular, fiercely loyal woman to bend the knee to the new queen consort. The audit was designed to be a crushing, unavoidable checkmate. Camilla's argument regarding the historical provenance of the antique stones seemed legally sound, heavily backed by the terrifying weight of institutional protocol, but she was entirely unprepared for the trap Edward had already set years earlier. The palace advisors confidently expected the Duchess of Edinburgh to quietly surrender her wedding crown. They believed the cold, procedural weight of the institution would easily crush any emotional attachment she held. But Prince Edward had spent a lifetime observing exactly how the monarchy consumed its own members. He did not issue a public complaint, nor did he beg his brother for familial mercy. Instead, he deployed his legal team. They arrived at Buckingham Palace carrying a document that immediately shattered the Queen Consort's argument. It was a formal deed of gift, dated 1999, and signed personally by the late Queen Elizabeth II. The document unequivocally classified the Enthemion tiara as a private, unconditional wedding present, permanently removing it from the royal trust. Yet, the true brilliance of Edward's defense was not the late Queen's signature. It was a hidden legal masterstroke that completely changed how the palace understood the conflict. During the creation of the tiara in 1999, Edward had worked intensely with the crown jewelers. He privately designed a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a magnificent necklace and earrings perfectly engineered to interlock with the aesthetic of the Enthemion tiara. While the crown provided the raw materials, Edward quietly registered and retained the exclusive intellectual property rights for the overarching design. His lawyers now presented a devastating reality. The tiara and the pearl set formed a single, inseparable artistic unit tied directly to Prince Edward's private intellectual property. The king could not legally seize the tiara without violating his own brother's copyright. It was a brilliantly executed trap, set decades in advance. But a purely legal victory was not enough to stop the institutional pressure. Edward knew he needed a deterrent so terrifying that the new regime would never dare target his household again. His legal team delivered a final, staggering ultimatum. If the relentless pursuit of Sophie's tiara was not formally dropped by the end of the day, Edward would be forced to defend his wife's property in an open court of law. And to prove his case, he would legally submit deeply private correspondence written by Queen Elizabeth II into the public record. These were not standard royal memorandums. According to highly placed palace insiders, these specific letters contained the late Queen's unfiltered, intensely personal thoughts regarding Camilla during the darkest years of the royal family's history. They held Elizabeth's unvarnished opinions from an era when she adamantly refused to accept Camilla's presence in her eldest son's life. This major revelation fundamentally changes the entire narrative. It forces anyone watching to pause and ask a deeply difficult question. Was Prince Edward justified in weaponizing his late mother's most private, potentially damaging letters to protect his loyal wife? Did the aggressive actions of the institution justify tearing down the carefully rebuilt public image of the new queen consort? The lines between victim and aggressor suddenly blur, leaving observers to fiercely debate whether this was an act of necessary protection or cold-blooded blackmail. Releasing those letters would instantly obliterate decades of expensive public relations work. It would drag the darkest shadows of the past directly into King Charles III's new reign, creating an unprecedented crisis. The machinery of the institution ground to a sudden, terrified halt. Edward had cornered the palace. But a threat on paper is easily ignored until someone with undeniable power decides to walk into the room. Following the devastating delivery of the legal dossier and the subsequent threat regarding the late Queen's most private letters, the battle immediately shifted from theoretical paperwork to highly visible, physical action. Prince Edward did not wait for the king's advisors to formally concede defeat. He understood perfectly well that the palace bureaucracy could delay, obfuscate, and stall for years if given the opportunity. Instead, he made an unprecedented tactical maneuver. He dispatched his own private security personnel directly to the royal vaults to physically retrieve the Enthemion tiara. This was an extraordinary breach of standard royal protocol. Usually, senior royal women request their jewelry through the master of the jewel house, relying entirely on the central royal administration to clean, secure, and deliver the priceless items for state banquets and formal photographs. Edward completely bypassed the entire institutional system. In a silent, highly controlled operation, the dazzling honeysuckle diamond crown was permanently extracted from the overarching royal collection. It was transported away from the king's reach and placed inside a high-security private safe, completely controlled by the Edinburgh household. It was now protected by security personnel who answered solely to Edward, not the sovereign. The visual symbolism of this extraction was profound. A senior member of the British royal family essentially seized a priceless historical artifact to protect it from the grasp of his own ruling monarch. When the heavy steel door of Edward's private vault locked, it sent an undeniable shockwave through the invisible hierarchy of Buckingham Palace. Word of the tiara's sudden removal spread rapidly through the highly guarded, carpeted corridors. Every private secretary, equerry, and household manager suddenly understood the severe gravity of the situation. The invisible bonds of family trust had utterly evaporated. Almost immediately, the vast, silent machinery of the royal household began to fracture. For decades, the staff operated under the strict illusion of total unity, serving the singular will of the monarch without question. But now, an unprecedented ideological divide severed the palace workforce. Quietly, the allegiances split. On one side stood the ambitious, streamlining regime of the King and Queen Camilla, demanding absolute central control and total obedience. On the other side stood the fiercely loyal, quietly defiant household of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, deeply representing the lingering, protective shadow of the late Queen. The daily working environment swiftly deteriorated into a landscape of intense paranoia. Whispered conversations abruptly ended the moment senior advisors from the King's office entered the room. Staff members who had loyally served the late monarch for decades began to quietly demonstrate their subtle support for Sophie. They started deliberately leaking minor scheduling advantages, quietly intercepting hostile bureaucratic requests, and fiercely protecting the Edinburgh's calendar. A dangerous, silent rebellion was brewing within the very walls that Charles now commanded. The united front of the modern Windsor dynasty was visibly crumbling from the inside out, buckling under the immense weight of internal retribution. Every official royal engagement, every shared balcony appearance, and every formal family gathering now required an exhausting level of psychological choreography. The king and his youngest brother were no longer operating as trusted family members. They were functioning as deeply suspicious rival factions trapped within the same gilded cage. The standoff had paralyzed the palace. The legal avenues were entirely exhausted, the physical assets were locked away, and the royal staff was hopelessly divided. Charles stubbornly refused to back down, desperately clinging to his heavily bruised authority, completely unaware that a devastating reckoning was rapidly approaching. He thought he could simply outlast his younger brother, until he was confronted by the one family member he truly feared. The bitter standoff between the two rival royal households had reached a suffocating stalemate. The lawyers had presented their impenetrable cases. The private secretaries had drawn their invisible battle lines, and the king remained stubbornly entrenched in his position. But the crisis was about to escalate far beyond the sterile realm of legal paperwork and bureaucratic maneuvers. The situation fundamentally changed the moment Princess Anne walked through the heavy wooden doors of the king's private office. To fully grasp the immense gravity of her sudden intervention, one must understand the profound emotional shift that had occurred between Princess Anne and the Duchess of Edinburgh over the preceding years. Historically, the Princess Royal was not known for her outward warmth. For decades, she maintained a strict, stoic distance from the younger generation of royal wives. But the devastating losses of Prince Philip in 2021 and subsequently Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 entirely altered the internal emotional architecture of the family. During those agonizing final years, Anne and Sophie became the two unbreakable pillars supporting the fading monarch. They shared the quiet, unseen burden of the late Queen's declining health, forging a deep, unspoken bond rooted in mutual grief and absolute loyalty. Sophie had lost her own biological mother many years prior, making her profound connection with the late Queen intensely personal. When Anne looked at Sophie, she did not merely see a sister-in-law. She saw the fiercely devoted woman who had acted as a surrogate daughter to her dying mother. She implicitly understood the profound cruelty of attacking those cherished emotional artifacts under the cold guise of modernization, and she absolutely refused to watch the new regime strip away the few precious tokens of affection her mother had left behind. When Princess Anne entered the king's office, she dispensed with all polite formalities. She did not sit down to debate the financial merits of the Bagshot Park lease, nor did she entertain Camilla's historical arguments regarding the antique diamonds embedded in the Enthemion tiara. Instead, she bypassed the petty details entirely and launched a direct, devastating attack on the very foundation of her brother's newly acquired authority. Her argument was as brilliant as it was brutal. She looked directly at King Charles and laid out a terrifying constitutional reality. She warned him that if he permitted his advisors to aggressively nullify the signed, legally binding documents executed by their late mother, he would instantly destroy the core credibility of the crown itself. The fundamental power of the British monarchy relies entirely upon the absolute trust placed in the sovereign's written word. If the formal signature of Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who reigned flawlessly for over 70 years, could be deemed utterly worthless the moment she passed away, then the signature of King Charles III would be worth absolutely nothing tomorrow. By attempting to evict his brother and seize his wife's tiara, Charles was not just insulting his family, he was systematically dismantling the inherited authority that kept him on the throne. Anne understood the dark, repetitive history of the institution better than anyone. She had quietly watched decades earlier as the palace machinery systematically isolated Princess Diana, stripping away her Royal Highness status and leaving her dangerously unprotected. Anne saw the exact same vicious, bureaucratic patterns now being deployed against Sophie, a woman who had faithfully served the crown without a single complaint. The Princess Royal drew a definitive line in the sand, making it fiercely clear that she would not remain a silent witness to another institutional betrayal. Anne's chilling constitutional warning left Charles trapped within a terrifying paradox, with absolutely no clean way out. He had vastly underestimated the fiercely protective alliance formed between his sister and his youngest brother. But it was her final, devastating ultimatum that truly broke the king's resolve. Princess Anne did not merely rely on a profound constitutional argument to break the king's resolve. Having thoroughly dismantled his justification for seizing the heavily contested assets, the Princess Royal delivered an ultimatum so severe that it threatened to tear the entire modern monarchy apart. If Queen Camilla refused to immediately halt her aggressive pursuit of the Anthemian tiara and Bagshot Park, Anne promised to drag the quietly concealed finances of the Queen Consort's own household directly into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The threat was absolute. Anne coldly informed her brother that she would personally oversee a merciless, fully transparent audit of every single expense, staff allocation, and private jewelry acquisition tied to Camilla's office. Because Anne had spent decades building an untouchable reputation for financial discipline and flawless dedication to duty, the king knew perfectly well that if his sister called for a public investigation, the British press and the global public would instantly believe her. But Anne did not stop at financial threats. She brought the fight directly to the future of the family itself. Behind the scenes, the king's advisors had been quietly applying immense pressure to prematurely strip Edward and Sophie's two children, James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, of their remaining royal protections, forcing them into entirely private lives to further shrink the institution's footprint. Anne fiercely vetoed this marginalization. She made it unequivocally clear that the destiny of those two young royals belonged exclusively to their parents, not to a power-hungry central bureaucracy. The sheer terror of Anne's threat forced the king to finally look beyond the gilded walls of his palaces and confront the catastrophic public explosion waiting just outside his gates. The timing of his crusade against his youngest brother could not have been more disastrous. The British public was currently suffering through a suffocating financial crisis, struggling to pay for basic necessities. How exactly would the nation react if the headlines suddenly revealed that the king was attempting to forcefully evict his own loyal brother from his family home? A home Edward had meticulously restored using millions of pounds of his own private money? The hypocrisy would be instantly weaponized by the media. The press would ruthlessly contrast Edward's flawless record of paying fair market rent with the glaring, unresolved scandal of Prince Andrew, who continued to reside in sprawling luxury at Royal Lodge without contributing a fraction of his fair share. The narrative would shift overnight. King Charles would no longer be viewed as a wise, streamlining modernizer. Instead, he would be painted as a vindictive, out-of-touch monarch aggressively punishing the wrong brother simply to appease his wife's ambition. The public would be deeply outraged by the staggering injustice, creating a highly volatile situation that the crown simply could not survive. The palace communications team would be entirely powerless to stop the onslaught. The fierce public debate would dominate television networks, international newspapers, and political discourse. It would ignite an explosive national conversation regarding royal wealth, hidden assets, and the basic morality of the newly crowned sovereign. The carefully crafted public image Charles had spent decades desperately trying to build would shatter irreparably in a matter of days. The king was finally cornered. The impenetrable legal walls built by Edward's team had stopped his advisors, and the terrifying, righteous fury of his sister had paralyzed his wife's ambitions. He was facing a complete, humiliating defeat on all fronts. Realizing the law and his family had turned against him, Charles attempted one final, desperate maneuver to bypass the lawyers. Faced with the absolute ruin of his legal crusade and the terrifying reality of his sister's public ultimatum, King Charles III found himself entirely outmaneuvered. The vast, intimidating machinery of the monarchy had utterly failed to crush his youngest brother. So, the king attempted a deeply familiar, highly manipulative tactic. He decided to step entirely outside the formal institutional system. He would no longer operate as the sovereign issuing bureaucratic decrees. He would suddenly pivot to playing the role of the concerned older brother. In a desperate bid to bypass the formidable legal barricade protecting Bagshot Park, Charles bypassed his private secretaries completely. Instead, he drafted a deeply personal, handwritten note sent directly to Prince Edward's private residence. The message was carefully crafted to sound like a gentle olive branch. The king simply requested a quiet, private family sit-down, just the two brothers, to politely smooth over the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past few months. It was a classic, highly effective royal maneuver, used the heavy, unspoken weight of family loyalty to secure concessions that the law could never actually enforce. But Edward understood the profound danger hidden within that deceptively simple invitation. A private meeting behind closed doors leaves no official record. It is a psychological battlefield where the king holds the ultimate home field advantage, relying on lifelong family guilt, silent intimidation, and the innate habit of deference to break a person's resolve. Edward had watched the exact same tactics slowly dismantle others who had dared to defy the crown. He knew perfectly well that if he walked into that room alone, his brother would use their late mother's memory, the fragile stability of the monarchy, and heavy emotional pressure to force a silent surrender. Edward's response was a masterclass in cold, calculated finality. He did not send a wavering emotional reply, nor did he attempt to politely justify his feelings to the sovereign. He issued a flat, devastating refusal. The Duke of Edinburgh formally informed the monarch that he would not attend any private meetings, nor would he engage in any informal familial negotiations, unless his entire legal team was physically present in the room. That single, uncompromising condition shattered the final illusion of their sibling relationship. It was a profound, highly symbolic gesture that completely rewrote the internal dynamics of the modern Windsor dynasty. By demanding the physical presence of lawyers for a basic conversation with his own brother, Edward was openly acknowledging that their family bond was completely dead. They were no longer operating as two brothers trying to resolve a personal disagreement. They were now functioning as two deeply suspicious, heavily armed heads of state, coldly negotiating across a heavily guarded border. The visual symbolism of this refusal was staggering. From that moment forward, every public appearance they shared would become a hollow, tightly choreographed performance. When they eventually stood shoulder to shoulder on the iconic palace balcony, or walked in silent procession during grand state events, the cheering public would see a perfectly united front. But behind the tailored uniforms and polite, practiced smiles, an impenetrable fortress of legal suspicion would forever separate them. The king had permanently broken the trust of the one man who had faithfully stood by his side for decades. Edward had effectively declared his complete independence from the emotional blackmail of the institution. Charles was left staring at the undeniable wreckage of his own authority. He could not force a private meeting, he could not win a legal battle, and he could not risk the explosive public nightmare his sister had promised. With the door firmly shut, the king had only one option left, and it was an option that would humiliate the institution. Late on the evening of March 25, 2026, the silent war came to an abrupt, unceremonious end. A highly formal note was dispatched from the tightly controlled office of the Master of the Jewel House, delivered directly to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The message was astonishingly brief. It contained no royal apologies, no elaborate explanations, and absolutely no admission of institutional overreach. It simply and coldly confirmed that the Anthemion tiara would permanently remain under her exclusive, private control. Almost simultaneously, the aggressive internal review of the Bagshot Park lease was quietly and permanently shut down. The official palace communications team carefully framed the sudden retreat as a polite recognition of the Edinburgh household's long-standing financial dedication to maintaining the sprawling Tudor estate. But behind the heavily guarded palace gates, absolutely no one misunderstood the true gravity of what had just transpired. The almighty crown had blinked. The king had stepped back. Everything Prince Edward had fought so fiercely to protect was firmly secured, remaining exactly where Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip had originally placed it. The institution was forced to silently admit legal defeat, putting its own humiliating retreat into the permanent historical record. But this profound victory did not bring peace to the Windsor family. Instead, it arrived with a devastating emotional cost that can never truly be repaired. The underlying structure of the British monarchy has fundamentally and irreversibly shifted. Inside the palace walls, there are now two distinct, deeply suspicious centers of power. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles and Queen Camilla continue to relentlessly push their strict vision of a heavily centralized, streamlined monarchy, demanding absolute obedience from everyone who remains. Safely away from that glittering center, an entirely different alliance has quietly solidified. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Sophie now form an impenetrable, protective wall, and crucially, they are quietly supported by the next generation, William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, who have watched the entire brutal saga unfold from the shadows. This secondary royal court does not operate loudly. They do not leak their grievances to the tabloids, but they are firmly holding a moral line, fiercely protecting the legacy built by the late Queen and absolutely refusing to let the new regime rewrite history. For King Charles III, he ultimately kept his streamlined monarchy. He maintained his formal structure and his constitutional authority, but what he permanently lost was the absolute trust of the one brother who had stood quietly by his side for decades, a brother who had consistently paid his own way and asked for absolutely nothing except to keep what was rightfully given to him. For the youngest members of this fractured dynasty, the harsh lessons of this battle will never be forgotten. James, Earl of Wessex, watched his father navigate a treacherous, silent war against the most powerful man in the country. He watched Edward fight not with public drama, but with flawless preparation, legal discipline, and absolute control. One day, many years from now, James will inherit the Dukedom of Edinburgh. He will carry the exact same title his grandfather proudly held for over 70 years. But when that day finally arrives, James will carry the legendary title with a completely different understanding of the family he serves. He will step into his royal future knowing perfectly well that the very institution that gives a gift is always quietly waiting for the perfect moment to take it back.